So this is a talk about identifying songbirds in flight.
What happened?
Please mute your microphones if you haven't already, or thanks, Matt, for doing that. Okay. So this first bird I put up here is kind of like a quiz. It's not actually a diurnal migrant, which is a migrant that migrates during the day, but I chose it for a specific reason. So you can try and guess what that is, or if you have no idea, that's fine. I probably wouldn't have known if I had looked at this, a couple years ago, but this is totally identifiable to family, at least, if not species, if you know where and when you are. This is a scarlet tanager. So I chose this because, nice, Eric, yeah. You got the right size, maybe. Yeah, and also if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat throughout, and I'll try to do questions at the end. Yeah, I chose this bird because a lot of people think of scarlet tanagers as these bright and beautiful birds of the springtime, but this is kind of what you'll see, about 15 minutes after sunrise if you're looking for migrating birds while they're in flight. And I'll talk more about that. And this was seen at the Dunes Observation Tower in May. So a breakdown of what I'm talking about. In the intro, I'm going to talk about what visual migration is about and a little bit about my story. And then I'm going to go through these species using videos of them in flight. And they're more or less arranged by size, with larger birds first and then getting to some smaller birds at the end. And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to share some resources, including books, guides, and then places where you can go experience Vis-mig, which is probably the most important thing for learning how to do this. So to start, I'm going to tell a story about October 5th last year. This video is from, you can see, 2:28 in the morning. And if you hear that, hopefully you can hear that. Can you hear that, Matt? Okay. I'll play it one more time. Those really high-pitched sounds are warblers. This is, okay, so what is this? This is my headphone earpiece, and there's a microphone set up in my porch in Chicago. So it's an insane number of bird calls that was happening all night, and there's mostly warblers, but also thrushes, bobolinks in there. And so the big question was, that morning when the sun came up, where was I going to go? And I didn't want to go somewhere that had a bunch of trees or shrubs where I can look at birds perch. I was curious if that morning I would see birds migrating, continuing to migrate, and boy, did I. This is what's called visual migration, and it's different. It's a different type of bird watching than you start out with usually. I didn't know it existed until I met people who told me, you can see this sometimes. These are mostly yellow rumped warblers with also a large number of palm warblers. And where I went, this is McCormick Place Bird Sanctuary. You can actually see that black building there is McCormick Place. And I had a great view of the sky. And these birds are going south because of the fall. And so they're continuing to migrate. They could also do other things in the early morning. Yellow rumped warbler is usually a nocturnal migrant, but on days or nights where there's a huge migration like that, you can see them in the morning. And a few of us tried to count the birds that day, which is really hard, but it's noteworthy that we had the new US highs for eBird that day for both yellow rumped warbler and palm warbler. Marky Muchler, Jacob Drucker, and Lila Freed counted at Promontory Point. And yeah, so Chicago is actually a pretty good place to see birds migrating like this. It's not the best place in the country, but it can happen, and it's mostly because of Lake Michigan. Um, so this is a little picture of my list from the day. Um, you'll often hear about the insane number of warblers, but there was also a lot of robins, a lot of cedar waxwings, a lot of goldfinches, and these are all diurnal migrants that started migrating once the warblers were kind of dropping off. And it's noteworthy that the waxwings and the goldfinches were actually new Cook County highs that day also. And instead of, I'm not just flexing here, I wanted to point this out because, a few years ago, before I knew about this type of birding, I never would have known that that many cedar waxwings were flying over my head throughout the day. So, it totally changes your experience of bird watching. And some other birds from that day, these were killdeer. And yeah, all these were seen in flight, so this took an understanding of how to identify these birds while they were flying over. I'll do it in a quasi quiz mode. This is a bobolink. There was a few dozen bobolinks flying over. And then another shorebird that was flying over in flocks. They were these birds with long bills. And the only time I had seen shorebirds with long bills flying over, they were dowitchers in Chicago, but I was standing next to my buddy Jacob, and he took one look at this flock of shorebirds, and he's like, those are snipe. And I was like, how the heck did you know that they were snipe? I learned later that, the time of year was right for snipe more than dowitcher, but he was describing the way they were flying. So yeah, it was just something I didn't know. Which, to be fair, this is very unusual to see flocks of snipe flying, past downtown Chicago, but there they are. So what about early spring? That was in the fall. This is what springtime, like the month of March, is about for me. This is what you can call a river of blackbirds. This is from the Indiana Dunes Tower. And yeah, it's mostly grackles here, but there are 5 species of blackbird that you can see in Chicagoland in Indiana. We don't see as many Brewer's blackbirds, but you get them at the Indiana Dunes. So yeah, another challenge: how do you identify blackbirds flying? Right, there's not a lot plumage-wise. So yes, people have become very good at doing this. And I'm not, by the way, very experienced at this. I've only been doing it for a couple of years, but I'm lucky enough that I've been able to travel around and stand next to people who are really good at it. And, I've been to places in the country where people have been doing this for decades and they see bazillions of birds every year. And so why am I doing this talk? Some people who know me might be like, what the heck is Woody doing, trying to lecture people on flight ID. But one thing I have learned for sure is that this is really difficult to talk about. A lot of the concepts involved are really vague or complex and difficult to describe. So experience is still the best way to learn it, but if you're going to try, shortening the amount of time it takes to learn, you have to be able to talk about it. And I've started a list of adjectives I've collected of people describing bird flight, and you see words like languid, dainty, elegant, powerful, weak, streamlined. This is not unusual. And, the thing that ties all these together is that they're really vague. They can mean one thing to one person and another thing to another person. I call this bird ID poetry, and not trying to knock it, as, totally useless. It's great if you know what you're talking about. But, a word like elegant is not particularly useful if you're trying to start out learning, how does, this bird fly? If I say it's very elegant, that probably doesn't help. We can do better. Yes. To take an analogy from the audio world, this is a quote from Facebook. And I thought this was really interesting because it uses 2 very different ways to describe the sounds made by tundra and trumpeter swans, and I've highlighted them here. High pitched and bass tone, I would say, are pretty darn objective, and uh, mean one thing to everybody, whereas yappy and honky are pretty vague, and I don't know. I don't think they're really necessary. And in audio, for years now, people have been using what are called sonograms to visualize sounds. And I'm not going to get too much into this, but the practice of making these pictures from the sounds has led to a whole vocabulary for talking about sounds. And when you learn that vocabulary and you learn how to read these pictures, for example, these really close lines, which are called harmonics, if they're really close together, that means that the pitch is lower. And I know that this is a trumpeter swan for that reason, versus the tundra over here. I hope I'm getting that right. I'm trying to do math while doing this. Okay, so yeah, it's created the big point is that when you learn how to read these pictures and learn the concepts involved, like harmonics, it changes the way you hear the birds when you're out in the field. So what about flight? So to get objective, cameras have taken people a long way. And you probably know of eBird, but you may not know that if you look at a species on eBird, you can set the filter for flying, and then you get all of these photos where if people decided to label their photos flying, you can look at all these beautiful photos of these birds flying and look at things like wingtip shape and undertail pattern that I'm going to talk about later. But the problem is that you'll see there's still very few videos, and a lot of identifying birds in flight, you need to know how they look over time. And so what I realized in my own private research was that even with a pretty crummy video, and then using a music program to put drum beats on every wing beat, I was able to study and compare different songbirds. That was an American Pipit. So to kind of summarize the main points of what I'm going to be talking about with each bird, the flight pattern, which is what I just showed for the Pipit, and then the shape, and then plumage, where I'm going to mostly be talking about contrast as opposed to like details or color. Sound I'm not going to be talking about, but it's worth noting that sound by itself can be more powerful than like anything else. Like if you hear the right sound, then you don't even need to see the bird. Flocking, I'll talk about a little bit, like the shape of flocks. And then finally, perceptual weight, which is basically when you learn all of these things for every bird, what actually is useful or obvious. One thing might be more obvious in one bird and not obvious in another, and it's not always useful, to know plumage or even flight pattern. So yeah, these are the main things I'm going to be talking about. I have to get some words or vocabulary to start out before I dig in, and this is called bounding flight, which is what most songbirds do when they're flying a significant distance. And it's split up into the flapping phase, which is the wing beats, which you can see on the left here. And it does happen while the birds are going down and then up. And then the second part is the bounding phase, where their wings are tucked next to their body. And so they'll do a bunch of wing beats, some number of wing beats, and then they'll tuck their wings and they make this arc, and then they go down again. And this is different from, waterfowl, which you can just see flapping constantly, or birds of prey, which will flap their wings and then glide. Some passerines do that, like swallows, or starlings do that sometimes, but I'm going to be talking about bounding flight. And then it's also useful to try and learn the whole duration of this cycle in each of the birds. Another aspect of bounding flight is the birds change in height through this cycle. So you'll notice that they go down in the wing beat phase and up in the bounding phase. And keeping track of that, it's something that people call undulating. I'm going to say that that's what undulating is. You know, how far, like what's the lowest point to the highest point in this cycle. And if it's not very steep, if it's a very short height, then that's what people call direct flight. So that's what they're talking about when they say a bird is undulating or flying direct. And then, yeah, and it's worth mentioning this, and I'll talk about this more, that the length of the bounding phase, like the duration of how much time they have their wings tucked, is very closely related to how high up and down they go. And if you took high school physics, you might remember that thing about how everything falls at the same rate. You know, neglecting air resistance. It's a similar thing here. You know, air resistance is important for flying birds, but it's going to be very closely related to how long their wings are tucked, how undulating they are. I'll show examples. The final thing, vertical speed change. It's a beautiful piece of language there. A lot of people talk about bounce when birds are flying, and what I'm going to translate this to in objective terms is how much you notice they're slowing down and speeding up. If you imagine like dropping a bouncy ball, it gets really fast at the bottom of its motion, and then it gets slow. It slows to a stop at the top. If a bird's flying really fast forward, even if it's going up and down, you might not notice that. Whereas if it's not flying as fast forward, you notice the bouncing nature, the speeding up and slowing down. You notice it a lot more. So that's what I'm going to call bounce. And so if you take one slide away from this whole talk, take this one. These, I think, are the words you need to objectively talk about all the birds I'm going to be showing from here on out. I'm almost at the videos, I promise. But first I need to give all my disclaimers so you can't come at me when you see a robin flying differently from how I'm about to talk about it. Okay, so flight is highly variable. Landing and taking off, birds look very different. Changing altitude or direction, which you do see when they're migrating, and it changes the pattern in their flight. Other things like feeding, display, running for their lives, like if they're being chased by a falcon, obviously they're going to fly different. Wind is actually a big one. It's just always a factor when birds are migrating. A lot of times they're trying to migrate when the wind is favorable for them to use the least amount of energy, and it does change the way they fly. But all that aside, I still think you can try and find the kind of like main tendency for every bird, like the base way that it flies when it's trying to get from point A to point B. They have characteristic flights, and it's mostly straight long distance flight, like meaning you see it flying the whole time you see it. It's not landing, it's not going up to perch in a tree. And you can assume that this is migratory, especially for species that are migratory, but also you see like house sparrows and starlings fly this way, even though they're not classically considered migratory. And so yeah, not this picture, this beautiful illustration by Sibley is from an article where he's showing a house sparrow, and you'll see their wing beats are in a totally different place from where I had them in the previous slide. But this green dot is a perch, and the bird is flying up to sit in the perch. So this is not migratory flight. It's not long distance flight. And it's not really what I'm talking about. Okay. So to start with, I'm going to compare different types of flapping phases and different durations of bounding phase. And this is the common grackle. Okay, so how can we describe the common grackle using the language that I'm talking about. The flapping phase is pretty regular. It has a similar duration and number of wing beats in each flapping phase. And it also has a long enough bounding phase where its wings are tucked that you see it rise and fall throughout the wing beat cycle. So regular wing beats and undulating are good words to describe a Okay, very different looking bird. This is an American robin. And before you say, oh, that bird is orange and the other one was black, I guarantee you, we're at the Dunes Tower, for example, when we were trying to count robins, we see many robins that are way far away and you cannot see that they're orange and they just look like gray blobs, but you can tell they're robins by their flight pattern for sure. So describing a robin's flight, you can say that the flapping phase is irregular. The number of wing beats it has changes a lot. It's like 1 wing beat, 2, 3, 2, and it's not as regular as the Grackle. And then the bounding phase is a lot shorter than in the Grackle. And so you can say that its flight is more direct. It's not undulating as much as the Grackle. Here it is again. Okay, and here's a flock of robins, and try to pay attention to how they're moving up and down because this is not edited like the other videos. So you might see some jerks as with each wing beat, or especially the periods of longer wing beats, but in general, they're pretty darn level, more so than a Grackle. Here's the Grackle again. And here's a new bird. This is a blue jay. And before I play it, take a look at the flight pattern down here and try to guess how it might fly. So it's got very regular wing beats, and there's hardly any bounding happening. So yeah, hardly any bounding, not undulating, very direct. So looking at these flight patterns next to each other, this is the same time scale. So these are just a direct comparison. They're pretty different. You see the regular wing beats in the Grackle with these longer periods of bounding where the spaces are. The robin is pretty irregular, and sometimes it has longer bounding, sometimes it's shorter, but it's not like this up and down thing that the Grackle is doing. And the blue jay is just like this, level. And I want to point out, I'm going to be showing the weight of all these birds. And I want to point out that these are fairly overlapping in their size and their weight, and yet they fly totally different. So it's not like larger birds fly one way and smaller birds fly another way. But I am going to draw some conclusions about size and flight. So here's a new species. This is the red-winged blackbird. Again, try to guess what's going to happen based on what you see in the flight pattern. You can see some really long bounding happening. All right, now I want to compare that to a grackle and try to use the concepts that I'm talking about to and here's the red-winged blackbird. So, what are the most obvious differences between those two? And try to use these ideas. Take a look at them. If I were to say what the most obvious differences are, I would say it's that the red-winged blackbird has less wing beats in each flapping phase and the grackle has more. That's one obvious difference. Okay. Red-winged blackbird also has a shorter flapping phase and a longer bounding phase. So because of that, it's going even more up and down than the grackle is. And also, if you may have noticed that the red-winged blackbird has slightly faster wing beats. I recommend trying to count them, especially for larger birds where you can count them. It helps you get a sense of how fast they're going. That's the red wing. That's the grackle. It's a little bit lagging compared to the red wing. And here's a flock of red-winged blackbirds, and this is to show the undulating nature of their flight, how much up and down they're going. So when you watch this video, just kind of zoom out and look at the whole flock and try to pay attention to how much up and down you see. So here's another bird, a European starling, not really thought of as migratory, but you can see hundreds of them flying like migratory birds on blackbird days, like days with big blackbird migrations. So they're good to know. They're not closely related to red-winged blackbirds. So here. Okay, here's the next one. And finally, here's a flock of European starlings just to see their undulating nature. How much up and down are they doing when they fly? This is flying. I think this was filmed by Adler Planetarium. You can see the buildings in the background. So to describe their flight, their flapping periods are pretty variable. Here you see like 3 and 4, but there are also these much longer periods, longer than you would typically see in the blackbirds that I've shown before. And their bounding phase is not as long as the flapping phase. They're less undulating looking than most of the blackbirds, but they're more undulating than the robins, for example. So here's red-winged blackbird flock again, and this is going to be to compare their undulating, yes, how much up and down they're. Also, oh, I can talk about the flock here. Blackbirds have pretty tight flocks. Starlings can be even tighter. Here's a starling flock. they're pretty undulating. It's not like they're not undulating, but they're more direct than the red-winged blackbirds. And then here's the robin flock. Look at how spaced out the robins are. That is typical of a robin flock. And they're not doing this regular up and down motion. It's more, you see little jerks with each wing beat, or they're just kind of trucking straight. And then the blue jay just cruising level. Okay, now I'm going to add in shape and plumage to the species that I'm doing. And for shape, I'm going to talk about just two things that I think are useful to start out. Wingtip is one. Starlings have pointed wingtips or tapered wingtips. And tail projection is the other thing. This isn't a perfect profile, but you can still see when the wings are folded, you have the wing on the top, and then towards the back of the bird, you have undertail coverts under the tail, and protruding past those, I'm just calling it the tail projection. It's not the same as the tail length, but I think it's kind of a more obvious thing to see. When you're seeing a bird, especially when its wings are tucked. If they have really long pointed wings, a lot of times the wings on top will obscure how long the tail is. So this is the tail projection here, and it's really short in a starling. So I'm going to compare all of that to the red-winged blackbird, which is, you can see them flying in the same flock. So wingtip shape. The red-winged blackbird's wingtip, not pointed. I'm gonna call it wide. You can call it whatever you want, but it's not as tapered as the starling wingtip. And then the tail projection is obviously longer. There you can see them. And I'm saying longer because this is all relative. It's not as long as a grackle tail or tail projection, but it's obviously longer than the starling. So next I'm going to talk about plumage. And when I say plumage, this type of image might come to mind where you see all these beautiful details and, spots and fringes on the feathers. That's not what I'm talking about. For flying birds, this is what I'm talking about. A typical view of a starling flock you see for, a few seconds. The question is often, are there any differences in contrast that might be noticeable at a distance or in a short amount of time? And with the starling, the answer is yes. They have these really pale wings and really dark bodies. And this is very obvious at a distance. Compare this to a red-winged blackbird. This is a male red-winged blackbird here, and they have no contrast at all. This is probably a first year male from the fall. This is a fall picture. And it doesn't really have this contrast. And then a female, this is something you'll actually see in the spring, has a pale wing, but it also has a paler body, and it doesn't really have this type of contrast going on. So a summary flight profile I would have for a species, you have the shape here, some plumage contrast here, and then the flight pattern. So I'm just going to do some more species. Cedar Waxwing is another, it's a later spring migrant, but it's also a diurnal migrant where you can watch waxwing flocks migrate, late into the morning, and they're really good to learn, and they're also really fun to watch. So you can see they have really long bounding cycles, and I'll show a picture of that, I think. But here's a flock of them, and you just watch, they really move up and down a lot. And they have these usually pretty tight flocks. They're Yes, those are waxwing flocks from August, where you can see all the big leaves on the trees. And it's pretty normal at McCormick Place to count thousands, or at least 1,000 in a day at that time of year flying by. It's really fun. They have a pretty regular wing beat flapping uh, section, flapping period. And the bounding periods are really long, like I said, so they really move up and down a lot, highly undulating. So the shape, you could see that their wingtips are fairly pointed, kind of like the Starling, maybe not as intensely tapered, but and their tail projection is also pretty short, not as short as the Starling. Here's the Starling again and the red-winged Blackbird. It's somewhere in between those two. You would probably be okay to call it a short tail projection or medium short. Plumage is an interesting one. Looking at this close photo, well lit, you can see that they have darker fronts and then these pale bellies and undersides towards the rear. But at a distance, they're only the undertail is really white, and a lot of this is yellow. At least when this photo is taken. Maybe they're more born in the spring, but I'm going to say that they're not super contrasty. And if you're close enough to see the contrast, you'll probably hear them. They make a lot of noise. So yeah, it's, color is not as contrasting as like pure white feathers are, I guess is the point I'm trying to make there. So there's my flight profile for Cedar Waxwing. Okay, American Pipit. This is another spring migrant that is a diurnal migrant that migrates through into the daytime. I'm getting into smaller birds now. Pipit is pretty lightweight. But one point I wanted to make here was that it's still larger than finches and warblers and sparrows. And when people say that a songbird is large or small, when you're talking in relative terms, what they're usually meaning is that the body is relatively larger or smaller compared to the head. So if you look at the head and body ratio of this bird, then you'll know that it's a larger bird. That's kind of the point I'm making. Because a lot of times you're like, a bird is larger or smaller, like, what do you really mean? Is like relative to what? So yeah, larger songbirds tend to have larger bodies and smaller heads. Okay, fairly long tail projection. And they have this interesting little kink in their wingtip. They do flap their wings really fast, but you can still pick this up if you know to look for it. The only thing I'll say about the plumage is they have these interesting tails that are jet black in the middle, and then their outer tail feathers have like pure white in them, and you can see that pretty far away. It does share that with horned lark, which is a kind of similar but a little larger bird. But look at the difference in the shape of the body of these two. These are another diurnal migrant, by the way, that we see in Chicago, migrating in Chicago. Look at the taper towards the rear of the bird and how thick it is in the chest. And that's also true in the profile. Like horned larks have really deep chests. Pipits are pretty even throughout their body. So here's the video of the pipit. And when I made these for pipits, I was really surprised, first of all, how many wing beats they had in these bursts of wing beats. And also, it's the only species I saw that did this thing where it alternated with one wing beat all the time. Like here's an even more exaggerated example. And a lot of times when they're doing that one wing beat, they're lowering in altitude, and then the period of many wing beats, they're raising in altitude again, and they lower with the less wing beats. It's a really interesting, kind of unique way of flying. So yes, long periods of fairly consistent number of wing beats interspersed with a variable number of single wing beats. Wing beats are really fast. So yeah, as I'm getting into smaller birds, their wing beats are going to be super fast and impossible to count. American goldfinch, even smaller. This is a diurnal migrant. Again, you may remember in the October 5th slide that I saw, I can't remember, between 1,000 and 2,000 of these migrating in a single day on the Chicago lakefront. And that number is not unusual at the Indiana Dunes in the spring. You can see 4 digits for sure. They have a really wide wingtip. Again, a pretty medium short tail projection. Here's the Cedar Waxwing again. And notice this is a larger bird, and notice how the body is larger than the goldfinch compared to the head. It's not a long tail bird. Here's a similar flying bird, the house finch, and it has a noticeably longer tail projection. Plumage, the only thing I'll talk about are the black flight feathers, which are pretty unique. It's funny, crossbills actually have that too, like red crossbills, which are having a moment down here right this year. But yeah, so look for finches with black flight feathers, and they have these goldfinches. They'll also have these really pale underwings, which you can see at a distance. This contrast, and they have really thick white wing bars, and you can see that pretty far away too. Here's the flight of the goldfinch. Here's another one. It has a really long bounding phase, probably longer than anything else I've shown today. Yeah, and the videos are getting more and more janky. The slower the birds are, probably. Here's a flock of goldfinches. Notice how spaced out they are. That's typical for a goldfinch flock. So yeah, super undulating, super up and down in how they fly. And you can kind of see that black and white wing contrast when they open their wings. See on the underwing of this bird right here, for example. That's pretty unique. Here's another flock. So yeah, to put it into words, it has a really long bounding phase, much longer than the flapping phase, super intense rise and fall. And now I'm finally going to talk about this concept of bounce, where when you watch them flying, you see a really dramatic change in vertical speed. Not how fast they're going forward, but they look like a bouncy ball in that they're really fast at the bottom of their wing beat cycle, and then at the top of the bounding cycle, they get really slow, and it's easy to attach to that when you see them flying. And they again have really fast wing beats. This is another one. I had no idea that goldfinches were flapping their wings like 6 times in each burst of wing beats until I slowed it down using 60 frames per second. And then another thing that I haven't talked about yet, the whole cycle of flapping and bounding is shorter with the goldfinch. And here I'm going to compare 3 undulating birds that are all going up and down. And this is the same time scale. But look at their weights and look at how the flat bound cycle, like the whole duration, is getting progressively smaller. And I've done this to enough birds that I think this is a fair conclusion to draw, that in smaller birds, you have one, faster wing beats. You can see how these are a lot closer together than the other two. And then they have a shorter whole cycle duration of flap and bound. So now I'm going to talk about the bounce, which is another thing you can see in Goldfinch, and I'll show a video of this again. But a little thought experiment here. Imagine that you have three different bird species, like the top, middle, and bottom are different birds, different species, and they all take this flight path in the same amount of time. So the difference is not how high up and down they're going, but how fast they're moving forward. And the way they can, one can go a lot farther in the same amount of time is if it's much faster in the forward direction. So, my videos with their sound could sound totally similar for all three of these, but they would look a lot different. And this could be due to different size, like maybe the top bird's a lot more powerful, it has more muscle power, maybe their wings are shaped differently. I don't really know, that's not the point. But these could hypothetically exist. And all three are undulating. By my definition of undulating, they're all going up and down the same degree, but which will appear to have the most bounce. So which will be most noticeable and how much it slows down and speeds up in each cycle. And you may have figured out my point, that it's the smaller, or maybe the one that's not fast forward, which is a lot like the goldfinch. And so, yeah, I'm saying that smaller undulating birds like finches, sparrows, and kinglets and gnatcatchers, which are really lightweight, they have a very much more obvious change in vertical speed, maybe because they have less total forward speed. That's kind of, I said it as a question. I haven't tested this, but I think that's probably one of the reasons, we say a bird bounces. So here's a flock of a mystery bird. And they're pretty undulating. You can see them moving up and down. They have less bounce. This is a house sparrow, by the way. They're pretty undulating, actually. When you see them traveling long distance, they have more finch-like flight, but they're still not as bouncy. It's not as obvious that they're moving, they're changing speed in the vertical direction as it is for a goldfinch, which is moving much slower forward. So here's the goldfinch. You see the bounce. And a goldfinch is a much lighter weight bird. Here's another bouncy bird that's really small, that's trying to escape Lake Michigan on this morning. And you can see how obvious it resembles a bouncing ball. It's not moving fast. I don't know how fast it's going, but it's so small that I know it's not fast. It's not flying as fast as a house sparrow, for example. This is a golden crowned kinglet, and look, it's 4 to 8 grams, super lightweight. So it has a relatively long bound and it's undulating, but that could be anything, But what can you say about it because it's small? It has a really short cycle between its flapping and bounding. Like the whole thing is compressed time-wise, and it has a really obvious vertical speed change. So I had to throw this one in here. I only have a couple more. These I don't have videos of, but I just want to point out that some of these are really similar looking, even though they look different in flight. Lapland longspur is a little bit smaller than a horned lark. And in the third row up here, you can kind of see that it has these shorter cycles than the lark does. But a lot of times they looked really darn similar and they sounded similar. But the Lapland longspur was, again, a little more bouncy. It didn't move as fast forward as the heavier horned lark. Yeah, this was kind of one that it was like, is there even a point in showing these two? But it's it's not the most obvious difference between the two birds. It's probably more obvious, their shape, I would say. Um, and then the last bird I'm going to talk about is yellow rumped warbler, which is not a diurnal migrant typically. It's mostly a nocturnal migrant along with all the other warblers. And its flight is pretty similar to the other warblers. And, when you see yellow rumped warblers in flight, typically it's really early in the morning when they're either continuing their nocturnal migration or they're changing. They're like, what do they call it? Repositioning. They've landed somewhere and they don't like it and they're going to try to get somewhere else. But it's good it's a good one to try and learn what warbler flight looks like. Even if you can't ID the species by their flight, you can look at something and say, oh, that's a warbler. It's not a goldfinch, or, for example. So here's yellow rumped warbler. Here's another one. And one more. So it's to talk about the yellow rumped warbler. I didn't make a slide for it, but it's obviously irregular. You can look at it down here. Their wing beats are, 1, 3, 3, 1, 1, 3, 2, whatever. It's not consistent, and they're pretty similar in length to the bounding phase of their flight. It's actually kind of similar to a robin, but I put these three together because I would call all three of them irregular in their wing beats. And you can see again that as you get smaller, lighter weight, the whole thing kind of compresses time-wise. I can't point to a regular pattern, but you can see the wing beats in the yellow rumped warbler are faster, and also the bounding periods are faster, and the whole flapping phases everything's faster. It's like take a robin and compress it, and to a lesser degree you can say that with the pipit. Not really though. It has these longer bounding periods than either of the other two. So yeah, there's those three. Now I'm going to talk about resources, books and guides. The Sibley guide, which you can get as an app on your phone. It's awesome. A lot of people use this, but a lot of people don't realize that when you scroll down on each species, it has these flight illustrations, and these are really made for the type of thing that I'm talking about here. Like, they're obviously showing wingtip shape, undertail patterns, and anything that might be really contrasty or bold at a distance. The Crossley Guide is a book that is pretty good for having descriptions of birds in flight. I feel like more than the other guides, it has good written descriptions. Again, it suffers from the same kind of vagueness, or you might not know what they're talking about before you learn it, but once you learn it, it's there to reference. I'm putting the reference guide to sea watching here. Even though it's about water birds, I think it's the best description of shape and appearance at a distance, which I have seen in any guide. Like, for each species, they have a section about how it's shaped, and then a section, for an American widgeon, what does it look like when it's a mile away? Because it's very different. And this is very relevant to songbirds in flight too. The Raptor ID app is really good in that it has videos, which is unique to any guide I know of, along with written descriptions. And I think that's probably because it's a lot easier to take videos of birds of prey. A lot of times they're soaring on thermals for 5 minutes or whatever. So yeah, that's a great app to learn flight with videos. And then also, finally, experience. Nothing beats it. The best you can hope for, using videos like these, is that you learn it faster, but nothing is better than seeing these birds flying, and especially standing next to somebody who knows more than you and you can ask questions to. For me, that place has been the Indiana Dunes State Park, the Green Tower. But if you want to find it on Google Maps, put in whatever that is in bold. Yeah, that's especially in May. They have a birding festival, but you can go there outside of the festival, and there'll probably be people there who are IDing warblers in flight, for example, and you can be like, "How did you know that was a magnolia warbler?" Learning to use the weather apps is huge. For Chicago specifically, we're always trying to see when land birds are going to be pushed up against the lake because they don't really want to migrate over water. They probably want to migrate somewhere where they can land if they have to. So yeah, I really love the Windy app and Birdcast. Those are two great resources you should definitely know about if you want to see birds migrating during the day. Is this a video? Yes. This is a video of southwest winds coming through Chicago. It's great for spring migration, but also I wanted to point out that if you saw this in late August, this would actually be the perfect day to go see a bunch of cedar waxwings on the lakefront. It doesn't have to be pointed in the direction that they're migrating necessarily, especially for some reason with diurnal migrants. Cedar waxwings, common nighthawks, and American goldfinches, southwest wind. I don't really know exactly why. It might have to do with getting lift or something, but whatever. So the places in Chicago that I would just, say are good to try this out. If you know Montrose probably, but if you go instead of into the hedge to see the birds, up close perched in a tree, you get there really early and go out to the fishhook pier, which is the pier that goes out into the lake. You can see birds coming in from nocturnal migration a lot. That could be really fun. So try that out instead of going to the hedge. Where I was on October 5th, where those videos were from, was the McCormick Place Bird Sanctuary. And Burnham is like the name for the stretch of green space along the lakefront there, all the way to 31st Street Harbor and south. And Northerly Island is north of McCormick Place. And, that's another good place for this. Promontory Point, going further south. Steelworkers Park, I've had great Vis-mig days there. And yes, anywhere on the lakefront, because you can always find your own place. It's really just about them not trying to fly over water. So there's the end of the talk slide. This is rusty blackbirds from the Dunes Tower, and there's also 2 grackles and a red-winged blackbird for you to try and figure out. So now I'll do questions if anybody has any. Or Matt, Matt, you want to say anything?
I was just gonna say thanks. That was really great.
Yeah.
I'm excited to try now. Try this out. And I was just putting in the chat. I don't know what your feeling is. Like you were talking about watching the weather. So my first question is, what do you think about tomorrow or maybe the next day? It seems like that's going to be our next maybe, right? If you're
yeah. I tomorrow in the afternoon is going to be great for hawks. I am going to the Dunes Tower on Tuesday. I'm counting there. So I'll be there, 15 minutes before the sun comes up. It's going to be a crazy blackbird robin day, Lapland longspur, horned lark. And, this time of year, the fun thing is as the season progresses, you're going to see something new each time. Like the question is like, what's going to be the new bird? Eastern Phoebe is one that's going to pop up, more now. But yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Awesome. Yeah. If anyone has questions, put them in the chat. I'm also going to just drop real quick links for our plant sale and to become a member again, just so that I can push those on everybody. And then also, Woody, you are going to do a walk next Saturday. Is that what it is?
Oh yeah, I totally forgot to. The absolute best place to learn about any of this is on my bird walks. Of course, for CBA, I'm doing one. I can't even remember if it's Saturday or it's Sunday, right? Or no, it's Saturday.
It's Saturday at 7 a.m. So you tell me, make sure it's
this Saturday at Park 566, and next Saturday, the 23rd, I'm doing 2 walks, and yes, we will see blackbirds and robins in flight, among other things.
got some good comments. Thanks, and it was mind blowing. So yes, I feel like the way that you structured the drum beats and everything seems to be like really helpful. I feel like it was like a nice visual to help.
Yeah, here's the playlist again. If anyone wants to see I put in the chat the videos of the birds by themselves. If you want to see that later, they're all there. Eric says, "Why did I put steelworkers over 566?" If you look at a map, I guess why? Like the shape of 566 is kind. I mean, does it really make a difference? I don't know, but I guess because where 566 and steelworkers are perpendicular to the lake does that make sense? Where they're running north and south.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the place where they'll be most concentrated. I don't know if that's true, but that's just been my experience. I have been at 566 and watched how like birds were concentrating down by the slip and not flying over my head for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's really hard. I mean, that whole area is kind of like, it's kind of a weird area, so it probably depends on the day.
Probably. Have you noticed a pattern with woodpeckers? I was told by someone they're very bouncy, especially flickers. Yeah, see, that's a really good example of how, flickers, I wouldn't like how I'm talking about bounce here. I wouldn't say they're bouncy. They're definitely undulating. You see a very obvious rise and fall with how they're flying. But so that's, an example of how the same word can mean different things to different people. Flickers, because they're larger, or maybe sometimes they fly a little more irregularly than red-bellied woodpecker, hairy, and downy. They'll fly more like a robin. And there are really awesome flicker days at the Dunes Tower where you can go and see hundreds of them in a day. They are diurnal migrants. So yeah, that's what I'll say about flickers. I don't know if that answered your question. Definitely a lot of rise and fall with woodpeckers.
Mhm.
I didn't include them, one, because they're really difficult to get videos of, and two, they're not songbirds. But you definitely see them migrating, in the spring.
Yeah, that's awesome. A lot of other great comments just saying how awesome it was, and you did a great job. So thanks a lot, Woody. This was a really great talk, and I feel
Hey, thank you all
yeah,
for listening. Hope
yeah.
it's helpful.